All right, so you've picked your smart car. You've bought yourself a 2008 to 2015 Smart Fortwo. That's the 451 generation or chassis, whatever you want to call it. And in my case, I need to get this thing in for a safety inspection in order to change the ownership on it. So I'm going to go through it, and I'm going to start by figuring out all the parts that I need to replace on the car. And to do that, I'm going to start by pulling the wheels off. I've got my wheel off. I'm having a look at the front suspension. I can see my spring isn't broken, a little bit of corrosion up at the top here, but that should be okay. And I had a helper turn the steering wheel with the wheel off here so I could have a look at the top perch on that strut and make sure that it was rotating properly. A lot of the times I think this broken spring happens because that bearing seizes up in the top there, doesn't allow the top to turn, so as you steer, it's uncoiling the spring, and then eventually it snaps and you end up with an unintentionally lowered car. Another thing I had to look at, my bushings on the A-arms, they still look good. The tie rod ends seem nice and tight, but obviously these brake rotors are going to have to be swapped out because they're in pretty rough shape. I'll check the brake pads at the same time when I have the caliper off. And one last thing I want to check is that wheel bearing. So I'm going to pull the caliper and bracket off and pull the rotor off and have a look at that bearing. I've pulled my rotor off. Now this dust shield's in pretty rough shape. I might be able to blast it and clean it up enough. If not, I'll have to order a new one. Checking the wheel bearing, I can see that it's actually in pretty good shape. No play, and it's not notchy when I spin it, so that should be okay. Having a look at the caliper here, I can see my pads are actually in quite good shape. They've been replaced recently, but this whole assembly needs to be really cleaned up. You'll notice I'm hanging the caliper, not leaving it dangling by the brake hose. Hung it with this bungee cord here so that it's out of the way and safe and not putting stress on that brake line. And that's about it for the front suspension. Here at the back, I've taken my wheel off. It's a bit of a different story. Having a look around, you can see there's quite a bit of corrosion on the engine cradle here. The drum as well, quite a bit of corrosion on it. I'm going to have to pull that off. I can feel there's quite a bit of resistance and some funny spots in there, so I think there's a good chance those brake shoes have maybe delaminated, something that's very common with these. And I can see in the back here my little crash bar is totally rusted away. That's going to have to be replaced for sure. Now, as far as the wheel speed sensors go, that's something I had mentioned is a common issue with these, the rear wheel speed sensors. The little trigger ring breaks and causes the traction control light to stay illuminated while you're driving, and you don't have your traction control system, you don't have your ABS when that happens. So on this car, it's actually broken, that rear ring, so we're going to have a look at that now so I can show you exactly what I mean. Now, here is the ring that we're talking about. See this ring here around the axle that has all these teeth in it? So if you look right here, you can see there's actually a crack in that ring. So what happens as the axle here corrodes and that rust starts to build up under the ring, it actually pushes the ring out and will crack. So having a look at this ring before I give it a clean bill of health, I noticed that crack in it, and that will prevent the traction control system from reading the wheel speed here correctly. And so I'm going to have to pull this axle out of the car and replace that ring. Now, as far as these rear springs, we've got these Brabus springs, but they're obviously broken. They're broken on both sides, so over here and in the back there's a crack as well. So these springs will have to be replaced, as well as these shocks, because I can see quite a bit of oil coming down the shock body here. So these things are probably pretty sacked out. I've taken off the rear drums, and you can see the brake shoes have already lost their linings. So that noise that I was hearing when I was spinning the drum, when it was still on, we could hear that scraping noise, was actually these two linings, which had become delaminated from the shoes. One of them's shorter and one of them's longer. I think the long one goes on the back. They had come delaminated from the shoes and were just sitting in the bottom of the drum like this, just rubbing on the drum as it was spinning around. So as soon as I took that drum off, the little lock screw here gave me a little bit of a hard time, so I had to hit it with some heat. But as soon as I got that drum off, linings fell out and gave everything a quick clean. You can see this hub looks pretty new, so I think that's been replaced at some point. The wheel bearing feels really good. I'll have to pop the axle out and just check it again to be sure, but it feels pretty good right now. Obviously, I'm going to have to disassemble the whole rear brake setup here, replace both those shoes, and probably a bunch of the hardware as well. So overall, not too bad. You know, that's pretty much what I expected. On the other side of the car, when I took that drum off, I couldn't even find the linings. These were missing in action. So obviously they had delaminated quite a long time before the previous owner, stopped driving the car, and they must have just been sitting in the bottom and wore away. This is really dangerous, by the way, and happens to all of the smart cars that I've seen. After, you know, 6 or 7 years of being on the car, these just come off, and I've actually been driving a smart car and had the whole wheel lock up solid that I couldn't get it to budge because one of these had come off when I was reversing and got jammed into the shoe here between the drum and the shoe. Totally locked that wheel up, couldn't move the car, had to actually take the car apart to get it to move again. So something that if you haven't checked on your older smart car, definitely get in there and check those right away. I'll show you guys a shoe that is actually on its way out. So here's a shoe that I replaced on a different smart car I was working on, and you can see the shoe has, you know, not a whole lot of wear on it compared to the original thickness. They're not a whole lot thicker than this, but you can see right here there's a crack starting to form, and you can see how that material is starting to peel away from the metal. And that's just due to corrosion getting in between the friction material. It starts to creep in at the edges, and then as it works its way in, it kind of peels that off. And you can see that it won't take much to take that material completely off. So that shoe is useless. That's why I replaced it on the other car. And if you have a look at your car, I'm sure if these haven't been replaced, it's going to be very similar.